Hi guys, and welcome back to the Scale Model Shed YouTube channel. And after seeing the replica fly at the Royal International Air Tattoo, it inspired me to build Tamiya's 148 Me262. And in this build I'm going to be adding some resin extras from CMK along with some 3D decals for the cockpit. I'm going to put a link to any extras I use in the build in the description below. And don't forget to check out the shop website at scalemodelsshed.co.uk. After removing all the parts for the cockpit from the sprues using a pair of sprue cutters, my first job was to remove the detail from the instrument panel to make way for the 3D decals. And once done, all the components to make up the cockpit assembly are primed in black. The instructions suggest the cockpit colour to be XF63 German Grey, but I opted to use XF24 Dark Grey as it's a closer match to the grey that's included on the 3D decals. It's suggested to aid fixing the decal using a CA glue, but I decided to use VMS's Transfer Fix as this will give me more time to position the decal. But you could also use a PVA or a glue such as Mig Ultra Glue for photo etch and clear parts. I'm going to add some texture and wear to the leather seat back using acrylic paints and an oil wash. Then some chipping is applied to the seat using Mr. Colour Silver and a sponge. The decal seat belts are toned down using a brown wash from Mig Ammo. The detail is further highlighted on the instrument panel by applying a black wash. I leave one of the seat belts loose in case I decide to have it hanging out of the cockpit. The inside of the fuselage is to be primed in black and then painted silver. And to avoid getting any paint onto the gluing surfaces, I decided to mask them off using liquid mask. That's the first time I've ever done this. It turned out to be pointless, but I thought why not give it a go. So if you're worried about getting any paint on any mating surfaces to be glued, it may be worth giving it a try. Once that's done, the cockpit can be glued into position. And here I'm relying on the fact that the plastic cement will melt through any paint and bond the plastic underneath. But just to be sure, I add a blob of black CA Flexi glue where it's not going to be visible. I'm going to be fitting an aftermarket resin front gun bay kit to the model. So before I glue the two fuselage halves together, I dry fit this whole front section. And when I'm cutting the resin, I dampen the saw so as not to create any harmful dust. The Tamiya kit provides you with a front nose weight section which also makes up the front wheel well. The CMK resin part slots over the top of this but is marginally too narrow, and this requires a small amount of metal to be filed away in order to achieve a good fit. And once this front section's done, I proceed to glue together the fuselage halves. So as well as the front gun bays, I'm also putting an exposed resin engine on this model. And this requires cutting away some parts of the original Tamiya kit. Firstly, this section where the resin gives you the wrap round of the front cowling. And you really can't tell how accurate the resin's going to be until you can fit it into position, by which point you've already removed the original part of the kit. And I did find it necessary to glue in a piece of thin plasticard to shim the resin out to have it line up correctly with the front wing plane. The next section is the resin base for the exposed engine. And this resin part has two wings out the back of it which should line up perfectly with the resin rear engine cone. But as you can see here, when the resin is put up against the plastic, it's going to be very difficult to get a perfect join, whereas the plastic part obviously fits perfectly. And the two parts are visually almost identical, and you're really gaining nothing from using the resin part. So I decide to do away with the whole resin rear section, cut the relevant parts out of the plastic and graft it into the resin base plate. To prepare the seam lines to ensure they weren't visible after painting, I first ensured the glue had had at least 12 hours to dry. I then used a brand new blade to shave plastic away from the seam until it was barely visible. The next step is using increasingly finer grades of sanding block, working up to a shine that gives you a finish much like the original plastic. Any additional work that may be necessary will become easily apparent at the priming stage, but for now we can rescribe the panel lines. At this point I'd already glued the wings together, but I decided I'd like the model with the flaps down. So I went ahead and cut them out with a modelling knife, using the panel lines as a guide. In order to fill the gap and create a nice shape on the back of the flap, I glued into position some semicircular styrene. I then used sprue goo, which is helpfully self-leveling, to fill the gap. And sprue goo is simply made by cutting up old bits of sprue and allowing it to melt into extra thin cement. And I first used this on my Harrier video, and I found it a really useful filler to have at my disposal. And this is a really good example of how it can be so useful. The front screen section was then glued on using VMS's transfer fix. And at the time this seemed like a trouble-free part of the build. But it caused me some serious problems towards the end, largely due to me ignoring any issues I had with this area. But I'll talk about that a little bit later on in the video. Don't do what I did here by not following the instructions and forgetting to glue in the inner part of the front windshield. Next step is to start masking the model ready for painting. After cleaning all surfaces carefully with some isopropyl alcohol, I give the whole model a thin coat of SMS's grey surfacer. And although this surfacer is designed to be sprayed straight from the bottle, I find it sprays best when thinned about 10% with a lacquer thinner. And as I mentioned earlier, priming the model instantly shows you any seam lines that still require some work. Any rough areas of primer are smoothed off with a 1000 grade sanding pad. And then any dust is removed using air from the airbrush. So I don't do a lot of pre-shading these days, but I figured this camouflage scheme was a pretty good candidate for some shaded panel lines. So I took some black and I shaded the panel lines on the whole model. And at the painting stage you can cover up as much or as little of this pre-shading as you like. So So now on to painting, and quite frankly trying to work out the RLM colours for this model blew my brain. So I decided to go with what I thought would look good. And I'm going to use Gunship Grey to tone down the RLM 76 light blue on the underside. My two top surface colours are going to be RLM 82 light green, highlighted with a late war RLM 83, and RLM 70 black green, with a little bit of brown violet mottled in. First job, I mottle Gunship Grey over the whole underside of the model. I then take RLM 76 and start mottling it into the areas I missed with the Gunship Grey, and then slowly blending in the layers to create the desired effect. First part of the camouflage to paint is the splinter camouflage on the top surfaces of the wings. The fuselage and any part of the wing that's going to be painted in RLM 70 is first masked off. The more vibrant late war RLM 83 is the first colour to be mottled onto the wings. This brighter green is also used to highlight the edge of the whole mottled camouflage pattern. The RLM 82 is then applied as the dominant green. All the way along, care is taken to leave the brighter green bordering the edge of the camouflage pattern where it meets the light blue. And this is also going to be true to border where the black green meets the light blue on the side of the fuselage. The masking is then swapped over and the RLM 70 black green is applied. Looking at the aircraft from the top, the splinter camo maintains across the top of the fuselage. But as you come down towards the sides, this blends out to a soft edge. So this hard edge camouflage is sprayed first using the RLM 83. As I said earlier, this brighter green is going to border the entire edge of the camouflage pattern. So the next job is to spray this camouflage line down the entire length of the fuselage. The RLM 82 and 83 can then be sprayed up to the line. So this was a warm day, and I think it was about 33 degrees when I tried to spray this, and the paint was not behaving whilst coming out of the airbrush. So due to some niggling tip dry, this brown violet part just turned out a complete mess. But I wasn't too concerned, as all the brown violet was going to be covered up using RLM70. However, I did discover that in this warm weather, adding about 10% Mr. Colour levelling thinner to the SMS paints did sort out any tip dry issues. The hard edge split between the greens was softened using RLM70. The speckled patterns were then applied using RLM82 and RLM70. Finally, I took some extra thin down RLM70 and did some post shading down the panel lines. Initially I painted this blue band using a Tamiya X3, but I found this blue to be a little bit too bright, so I changed it to a slightly deeper C328. Before moving on to the decals, all this paintwork was sealed in using a gloss varnish. And I usually thin GX100 using about 70% levelling thinner. Some microset is applied to the model and the decal is laid on over the top. Then microsol is used over the top of the decal to soften it. I use a cotton bud in a rolling motion to set the decal down onto the model. If necessary, and once completely dry, the top of the decal can be lightly sanded. This can be done to smooth the surface of the decal due to any dust or fibres caught underneath it. Finally, the appearance of the paint and the decals is unified using an all-over coat of matte varnish. I simulate some paint chipping using a Mr. Colour silver applied with a brush and a sponge. For this I like to use a lacquer based silver such as Mr. Colour. Reason being that when the lacquer paint dries it takes on more of a sticky consistency. And this makes it easier to create more realistic looking paint abrasion. So I'm going to briefly come back to this front screen section, which I'm sure a lot of you have been yelling at the screen about. And yep, I agree with you, it looks awful. My lack of foresight on this part was twofold. Firstly, during the preparation process I assumed it would look okay once it was painted. And then latterly, once it was painted, I assumed I could make it look okay on the finished model. Either way, the only thing to do at this point was to try and remove it, causing as little damage as possible. And after some cleanup you can kind of see the issue that it sort of doesn't fit. The width of the part seems slightly narrower than the fuselage it's going up against, and you can see this on Tamiya's model that it looks like it's got the same issue. And after screenshotting an earlier part of the video I can kind of forgive myself for thinking that during the build it was going to work. So there was nothing else to do at this point but put my head in the sand again and move on to some weathering. I'm going to use Mig Ammo's green-brown panel line wash. I start by wetting the area with odourless enamel thinners. I apply the wash into the panel line and then blend it across the rest of the panel almost like a filter. The panel line wash naturally stays inside the panel line, and on the main surface of the wing, blending it this way creates some really nice tonal variation. And because I'm using a fair amount of thinners, its effect is nice and subtle. And remember, this wash is an enamel, so much like oils, you could easily manipulate it with some thinners the next day. And here you can see the subtle difference between the side of the fuselage that's had the panel line wash compared to the side that hasn't. I used a black panel line wash on the recess of the ailerons to create a fake shadow. Changing the tone for the underside, I created an oil wash using Abtielung's neutral grey and sepia. and I thinned it using their matte effect thinner. For a polished finish on the pneumatic strut on the landing gear, I'm using an SMS chrome pen. Then the detail is picked out using a black wash. So with the model nearly complete, I moved on to the CMK Jumo engine. So once the engine was assembled, the whole thing was primed using a Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. And then as a base colour for the whole engine, I use a Mig A-stand semi-matte aluminium. Some of the pipework on the engine was picked out in a different colour using AK Extreme Metal Steel. Then the painted black section around the centre was dry brushed with silver. Then all the detail was picked out using a black wash. And once finished, the engine was glued into position under the wing. And finally, the flaps, the gun bay doors and the canopy were fitted. So with the front screen fitting as neat as I could get it to, I went ahead and did some final video of the finished model. And yeah, no. So there was nothing else left to do. I glued it on with some extra thin cement, and on a completed model I pulled out the filler. And this is far from ideal, but it is a good exercise to show that even on a completed model you can backtrack and change things. I carefully sanded the seam, being careful not to damage the clear plastic or that decal. A bit of black primer helped me better see what work was necessary. Once I thought the sanded area was good enough, I applied some Mr. Surfacer 500 to the area to act as a high build primer. This was then carefully sanded back to a smooth finish. Luckily enough, the area I was working on was all painted in RLM 70 black green, so this was then reapplied. Any areas where the new paint overlapped the old paint was carefully sanded to eradicate any minor step. The two layers were then blended together. I applied one coat of matte varnish, which, due to the amount of work I've been doing on the area, required some flatting back. So after having a nightmare trying to hold the model, snapping off the gun bay doors, breaking off the canopy and breaking the seat belt, one final coat of matte varnish finished the job. But if I was doing this model again, I'd be sure to get that seam filled at the preparation stage. So that's it for this video. Not a perfect build, but I'm pleased I could show you how I rectified the problem. So thank you so much for watching. Please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Check out the website at scalemodelsshed.co.uk, or if you're down in our part of the world, it'd be great to see you in the shop. So happy modelling everyone, and see you next time.